We're having a special session welcoming to The Hague Mrs. Evgenia Kara-Murza. She is a Russian human rights activist and human rights defender, campaigning for solidarity with Russian pro-democracy activists and activists against Russia's war in Ukraine, and a voice for political prisoners in the Russian Federation. She's the wife of Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is well known for his opposition to the Putin regime, for his cooperations with Boris Nemtsov, for his advocacy for Magnitsky laws in the US, the UK, and elsewhere in the world, and for having been poisoned twice, 2015 and 2017, I believe, and was sentenced last year to 25 years imprisonment in a politically motivated case. Meanwhile, Mrs. Kara-Murza ensures the continuation of his work to hold the Russian government accountable for its commitments and obligations regarding the rule of law, human rights and democracy. And as such, she has been working with Mr. Pieter Omtzigt via the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, who has invited you here today. Mrs. Kara-Murza has graduated from the Moscow State Linguistic University, has worked as an interpreter and translator for several NGOs, including the Free Russia Foundation, and before joining her husband in his pro-democracy and human rights work. Mrs. Kara-Murza, we are honored that you are joining us here today. I'm proposing that we give you the floor for a short introduction, after which I'll go to the members of parliament present to raise questions to you that you then can answer. We have a total of 1 hour for this meeting. Mrs. Kara-Murza.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I want to say, first of all, what an incredible privilege it is to be here today. And it is my first time in the Netherlands and my first time in The Hague. And believe me, this is a place that I've wanted to visit for a long time. It is a very meaningful place for us Russians who want a different future for our country. And it is to this place that we hope one day to bring the war criminal that is on the list of war criminals wanted by the ICC. Several days ago, the Russian army bombed yet another shopping center in Kharkiv, killing a lot of people. In Russia, according to Ovidinfo, an independent media project monitoring political persecution, from January 1st to May 5th of this year alone, in those few months, 970 people were detained at public events throughout the country, which means that in Russia nowadays, roughly 8 people are getting detained for opposing the regime, for spreading information, for saying no to the war, 8 people per day, roughly. I am here today because 20 years ago I married a man of integrity. A man to whom black is black and white is white. A man who has continuously stood for human rights and the rule of law in my country. My husband has been in the opposition to Vladimir Putin's regime since Vladimir Putin came to power all those years ago. And for all these years, I've heard my husband say, honestly, just plead with our partners in the West, please pay attention to what Vladimir Putin is doing. Please do not disregard, do not ignore human rights violations that are happening in our country. Please bear in mind that in Russia's case, political repression inside always inevitably leads to aggression outside. It happened before, it will happen again. Now, we are watching a full-scale invasion against Ukraine, a full-blown war of aggression happening in the middle of Europe. And I believe we need to be absolutely clear about understanding that this is the result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed while committing very similar crimes to the ones that are being committed now in Ukraine and against Ukraine. It is an absolute fact that can be easily proven. Vladimir Putin came to power with the bombings of apartment buildings in Moscow. Then there was the war in Chechnya, where war crimes were being committed and documented by human rights activists and journalists. Then there was the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and the bombing of civilian population in Syria. And all these years, peaceful protests in Russia were being violently squashed time after time after time in the eyes of the entire world. And not once has Vladimir Putin been really slapped on the wrist. So imagine the situation through his eyes. He sees that war crimes in Chechnya and in Syria are allowed, so why not in Ukraine? He sees that the annexation of Crimea and the annexation of part of the Georgian territory is allowed, so why not the rest of Ukraine? He sees that business interests will always prevail over human rights, like it happened in 2012, when people were beaten into pulp in the streets of Moscow during peaceful protests. And then Western democracies expressed deep concern and signed the deal for the construction of Nord Stream. So time and again, Vladimir Putin was led to believe that he could get away with those things. Is it really surprising that he launched a full-blown war of aggression in the middle of Europe that takes away lives on a daily basis, more and more lives, and destroys the system of safety and security on the continent? Now, human rights violations in Russia are not something new. They have been happening for all these 25 years of Vladimir Putin in power. Even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia held over 300 political prisoners, according to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization and co-laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. That organization, Memorial, was of course labeled as undesirable in Russia and banned in Russia. They continue their work despite all odds, and they always tell us that we give you these estimates. Be aware these estimates are very conservative, because we know what Vladimir Putin is doing in the country on the large scale. International observers and rapporteurs are consistently denied entry to the country. Independent media, all large independent media, have been banned and blocked in the country. And those few journalists who remain in the country work very much, anonymously, underground. Human rights organizations are being labeled as undesirable, foreign agents, extremist, or terrorist. In fact, any dissent in Russia is being treated just like in the Soviet times, as treason, or terrorism, or extremism. My husband was sentenced to 25 years of strict regime, and the official indictment said that, and I actually quote, that the speeches that he made, the public speeches that my husband made at the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, at NATO, at the US Congress, these speeches posed a threat to the national security of the Russian Federation and damaged the image of the Russian Federation on the international stage. My husband was labeled a foreign agent. He was tried for high treason, for spreading so-called knowingly false information about the war in Ukraine, and for being affiliated with an undesirable organization. All these accusations are being today used in Russia against hundreds and hundreds of people. Because Vladimir Putin, I think, deep down realizes, and I get this question very often, is there an alternative to Vladimir Putin? If not Vladimir Putin, then whom? Prigozhin? The likes of Prigozhin? Prigozhin is no more. Thank God for little blessings. But the likes of Prigozhin? Is there an alternative? And I think that Vladimir Putin realizes that there is an alternative. And you're watching him try and destroy that alternative right before your eyes. Because the only guarantee of peace and stability on the continent is a democratic Russia. And it has to be fully understood, because for as long as there is this regime in the Kremlin Repression inside will continue and warmongering will continue. Vladimir Putin will not be content with occupying Ukraine. He will go further. And actually, certain plans have already been exposed by Russian independent journalists, some plans on Moldova. So Vladimir Putin, who believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, will go on as far as he is allowed. He is a bully who does not understand the notion of compromise. Vladimir Putin sees compromise as a weakness, and as any bully, he pushes for as long and until he's punished. I believe that this is what we're dealing with, and Western policy should be very clear about Western politicians, Western leaders who stand for the rule of law and democracy. They should be clear about who Vladimir Putin is and what his regime represents. And there are certain things that can help send this powerful signal. And I'm very grateful for the work of Mr. Pieter Omtzigt that he carried at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, preparing a report on the legitimacy of the so-called referendum that was carried out in Russia in 2020 that basically destroyed the country's constitution and made Vladimir Putin into a tsar. Since then, Vladimir Putin had absolutely no right to run for president for the 5th time, mind you, 5th time. And since then, however, he not only carried out this ridiculous so-called election, but he appointed himself president of the Russian Federation for the 5th time. This clearly violates international law as well as Russian, because this so-called election was carried out on occupied Ukrainian territories where people were coerced to vote in the right way. Vladimir Putin destroyed basically the country's constitution, making himself into a tsar by annulling all his previous terms. And the third reason for not recognizing his legitimacy is the fact that every single opponent of his has been either imprisoned, thrown out of the country, or assassinated. And I realize that you all know that Alexei Navalny recently died in prison, and we believe that this was murder, whether it was done with premeditation or because he was poisoned first, then thrown in prison and kept in conditions incompatible with life for 3 years, which led to him just collapsing and dying. Whichever way you look at it, this was murder. And before that was Boris Nemtsov in 2015 on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge in downtown Moscow, 100 meters away from the Kremlin walls. My husband survived 2 assassination attacks with poison in retaliation for his work on the Magnitsky legislation. Twice, our kids and I saw him in a coma with a multiple organ failure, twice in 2 years. And it took him over a year to relearn how to walk and use a spoon. This is the nature of this regime. This is the mode of communicating with the world that Vladimir Putin practices, and that the system that he installed in the country will continue practicing for as long as they're allowed to do that. Thank you very much.